Today we are going back to class. We have a lesson for today on philosophy and theology to honor the creation on this very day of the University of Constantinople 1599 years ago. So today we have a lesson in class about the state of mythic raiding and more in general the state of raiding. This is through a post made by Dobby, which is the GM of Nascent, a US guild which has been in the top 100 for years at this point. So a pretty good Hall of Fame level, Hall of Fame quality guild, and he has highlighted a few of the problems currently going on in raiding, what could maybe be fixed or improved when it comes to raiding. The first point being made here, the pace and structure of raids, is a bit on the nostalgic side. It's about why do we still have the same typical 4 zones, 8 dungeons and 1 raid? Why do we always have the same mega raid instead of smaller raids, smaller size raids, Magteridon's lair, Gruul lair, Onyxia's lair, all of these collections of lairs, where have they gone? Why do we still have, just one huge raid with either 9, 10 or 11 bosses over and over? I don't think that's very relevant. I don't think that taking a Mirjasil and splitting a Mirjasil into a 4 boss raid, another 4 boss raid and a couple bosses in a single raid alone would actually have changed anything about the flavor of the raids in a season. What I think would have been much better in terms of keeping the engagement of the player base when it comes to raids is, and with the help of Paint I can show you, is doing this, right? The hype of the player base generally goes to the max at the release of the expansion, stays up for a bit, and then goes down and down and down until it starts to pick back up at the release of Season 2 and the next big patch. It goes up and stays high for a bit and then goes down and down and down until the release of the next season. What could be helping this drought of players towards the tail end of a season is to split the 10 boss raid you are releasing every season, right, all at once at the same time, is to instead have 5 bosses at the start and then 5 bosses in the middle, right? Pair them with the release of 10.0.5 or 10.1.5, 10.2.5. You release them right in the middle, 3 or so months into the season. So this way, ideally, the player's engagement in the patch goes high at the release, stays high, and then instead of dropping down when nothing else is going on, it remains high because there are 5 new bosses and a new raid being added. Imagine if a Mirjasil, let's just say a Mirjasil had 10 bosses, there was a copy of Smolderon, Flower Smolderon instead of Fire Smolderon. You could have the first raid, fire-themed, fire-based, Igira, Volcaros, Larodar, Smolderon, and Tindral. And then you have the other raid released 3 months later with Nalroot, Council, Nimue, the Flower Smolderon version, and Farak. Those would also be quite even in terms of difficulty. One has Flowery Smolderon plus Farak, the other one has Smolderon and Tindral. Those are pretty even in terms of difficulty, right? And they are released 3 months apart. So now you get to deal with the first 5 at the start and then the other 5 later on. I think that would be much better rather than this request of having simply small raids coming back. Because I don't think splitting a huge raid into 3 smaller versions actually, fixes anything about raiding. I think what could be way more relevant is the time in which these raids are released. In that case then, yes, splitting the raid into smaller versions would be beneficial. The second point, or we should say 2 points at once, are the tuning problems of the bosses, together with farm no longer providing the benefits it once did. The tuning problem is, quite simple. We have now gotten into a situation where we have quite the front-loaded power-up in the form of tier sets. The constant complaints of the player base of feeling terrible if they don't have a tier set made it so that now we even got the catalyst on week 1, plus the token if you get ahead of the curve, or 2.5k mythic class rating, giving you basically 2 instant tier tokens, right? So it made it much faster to get your tier. The power scaling got even worse with how fast we were able to get gear. remember the points made in Season 2 on how fast we were able to get close to max item level in the first 2 weeks only. 443 to 444 item level on week 2 was possible in Aberrus. So this massive power-up made the first early bosses a joke, and then the later bosses are a slog. This is a nice, cute spreadsheet I made about each and every tier of the past 2 expansions, with the amount of wipes per boss and the total hours spent on each boss with the averages. You can see that the average time spent on Amirjosil, for example, the average hours of progression, is not even that high. Lots of people mention Tindral and Farak being super hard and taking super high amounts of wipes. However, that doesn't matter once the early bosses are a joke, even though the amount of time spent in Amirjosil is the same as Sanctum, right? And that's the difference. The difference is that the first bosses of the raid were a joke. Pretty much every single boss up to Smolderon didn't even take more than 3 hours to go through, which is the worst out of every raid we have gotten in the past 2 expansions. And then the later bosses become a massive cockblock. You can see that, for example, Tindral required more time of progression than every other boss combined before him. But that's not even the thing. The thing is that Smolderon required more progress than any other boss before him combined. And if you think Amirjosil was some kind of, unique type of situation in the negative, it's actually almost the opposite. These are the amount of hours on average a guild has spent on Amirjosil, 75. That's the same as Sanctum. That's like 17 hours less than Castelnatria. That's 13 hours less than Sepulchre. It's not that the raid itself was terrible, it was the gap. It was the gap in difficulty from the first bosses to the last ones that is far too large. The problem with tuning, of course, also creates the issue of nerfs. Blizzard has to manually nerf these bosses over and over, when back in the days you would be getting power naturally over time, with the infamous borrowed powers. Because over time, in Nyalota, things get easy because of corruptions. In Eternal Palace, because of your essences on your necklace and your scaling necklace level. These did not exist in Sepulchre, or in Vault, or in Aberrus, or in Amirjosil. There was no endlessly or high scaling power deeper into the season. You had nothing. You got to max item level very early, 2 weeks, 3 weeks in Aberrus, about a month in Amirjosil, and that's it. That's your power for the rest of the season. You get, 6 sockets in your gear extra. You get the helmet enchant that Blizzard tried to put as a way to scale our power, but that helmet enchant is terrible. So we don't really get much power deeper into the season, which means Blizzard is forced to manually nerf the bosses over and over and over until they become more and more killable outside of the race to world first. And it also understandably can be quite frustrating or feel bad if you are a lower level guild trying to progress on Tindral and then Blizzard pushes in some tuning. And then 1 week later, Blizzard pushes in more tuning. In some cases it's even terrible because you have to relearn certain timings. You have to relearn certain mechanics because they are being changed midway through by Blizzard. This is something that has become more and more relevant in this expansion. If you remember the whole clusterfuck, for example, around Aberrus on Zaskarn, having to be almost changed into a different fight halfway through the progression, but also multiple nerfs to the mechanics of, for example, the Echo of Neltarion, with the infamous bomb mechanic that you had to deal with in that fight. So you have a combo of the tuning problem, which also makes farming no longer providing much of the benefits it once did, because if you get to max level, max power in 3 weeks, what are you farming for? What are the juicy special items you're still gunning for in the raid? Nowadays, you only have 1, maybe 2 items you might want, and that's not because they are rare, that's because there is a list of 15 players who want that item, right? Remember the trinket from the Forgotten Experiments in Aberrus? Or perhaps the trinket from the Urna on Vault, or perhaps, guess what, the trinket from Council, Pip's trinket on Amirjosil, right? There aren't that many other items being sought after, so farm becomes much less engaging, much less relevant. It should be a nice time for your guild to chill together, create some camaraderie, some cool moments together, but instead it's mostly just a slog through bosses that give nothing to anyone. Both of these problems can be fixed some way by Blizzard. For example, the farm can start to be fixable by giving cooler things as rewards in the raid, right? For example, why don't we go back to have these achievements, these hard modes for every boss that unlock extra rewards? Or perhaps weekly quests. There is now an NPC before every boss with a weekly quest that has you complete the boss in a certain way, and if you do that, you get a juicy reward for your character that could help the power up throughout the season so that you don't need the constant tuning from Blizzard. For example, what about defeating Volcaros with only 2 healers? And that gives you a token item with Leech on it. What about defeating Council in less than 4 minutes? If you do that, everyone get a free socket item that they can put on an item that doesn't have the socket available, like for example a weapon or maybe a chest piece. What about defeating Larodar without the 3 ends doing any damage in the last phase, meaning you have to perfectly crowd control them without anyone breaking or running to a player and damaging it? And that could give you another token you can use to add the tertiary stat avoidance to a piece of gear. Right? All of these would be weekly quests, and they would be slowly empowering your character to the point where possibly Blizzard wouldn't have to manually tune bosses and constantly nerf them over and over, because the characters are getting stronger by themselves. And talking about engaging farm, it doesn't have to just be actual power rewards. Another complaint from many players, and this goes also into the Mythic Plus category, is the lack of rewards. What about more mounts? More toys, more pets? What about the titles? What about transmogs? Why don't we get them for these bosses more than that? Why there is only like 1 mount in this raid and 1 title in this raid? There should be 7 mounts in a mythic raid and 10 titles in a mythic raid for you to achieve throughout the season. Different types of achievements asking you to do different things on the different bosses to get yourself the mounts, to get yourself the titles, the transmog appearances, etc, etc. That can also help making farm more engaging compared to what we have right now. These two are definitely the chunkier problems going on right now in the raid, having the problem of constantly having to nerf the bosses because the players no longer scale with power over a season, because the season just stops in terms of power-ups in the first like 3 weeks, and then you are at max item level, so it's over. That is something that could be fixed. The other problem being pointed out here is the raid composition becoming extremely restrictive. Many players here will point out, oh, but this is only for the world first guilds. No, as we often mention whenever someone tries to discard an argument because it's only relevant for the world first guilds, is that this is going to be a trickle-down effect. Players will just copy what the best players do, regardless, even if they don't need to, for the difficulty they are playing in. And this has created quite the big problem. Quite the big problem because, you know, you have the situation where at this point you have almost 15 mandatory choices in the raid, from the auras of the paladins, the mandatory buffs of priest, mage, monk, demon hunter. Nowadays you also have the added rogue with 3% damage reduction, the added damage at high HP from hunters now. Why not? Let's sprinkle in an enhancement shaman for Wind Fury Totem. What about the augmentation evoker newly added? Let's bring them all in. It makes you having a much harder time being able to juggle around a large roster. Back in the days, it was completely normal to have 25 players in a roster for 20 spots in a raid, but nowadays it has become quite hard, because how can you find room for those 5 players on the bench to be rotated in if every other boss has an almost locked composition? Between the mandatory buffs and the flavor of the month damage of certain specs, it makes it much harder for you to be able to juggle around and rotate your roster. which ultimately creates problems, because some players won't be happy with their playtime, they will leave, it makes it harder for you to have ready backups, for example, if one of your players with a mandatory buff or debuff is missing, quits, leaves. Now you have a problem. Now you don't have a backup for that type of buff or debuff, and you have to go and frantically try to find a new one or ask some other player to reroll to have that spec available. This was made even worse by this expansion with the track record of Blizzard reworking specs. Nowadays, it seems like every other spec that was reworked was completely broken, or even specs introduced into the game. You know, the new Preservation, OP, reworked Prot Paladin, OP, reworked Holy Paladin, OP, buffed Guardian Druid plus reworked Shadow Priest and Fire Mage, all OP, newly introduced Augmentation, OP, reworked Vengeance, reworked Havoc, both OP. It makes being able to manage a raid roster much more volatile nowadays, having to be more restrictive, for example, when you're recruiting. Now, a Druid leaves, well, I guess we are recruiting for a Druid because we need Mark of the Wild. So that's the only option we have right now. That is also making it much harder for raiding guilds compared to Mythic Plus, especially because Mythic Plus has plenty different levels for each players to find themselves in. You could be comfortable at doing plus 25s or doing plus 29s. You can do plus 25s as a Fury Warrior and not nearly as much do plus 29s. It's okay, you still have room to play in plus 25s. Mythic Raiding is not like that. Mythic Raiding is just one difficulty, one for all, and all of these extra buffs and debuffs and possible utility for every encounter has made it much more restrictive and complicated for you to keep a healthy roster in Mythic Raiding right now. This problem, the user interface problem, I understand and agree with, although I don't think it's too big of an issue. The only reason, yes, the only reason it's not too big of an issue is because we have community answers to this. DBM, bigwigs, and weak auras are what are fixing the problem that the user interface of Blizzard is ancient. Especially when you put it next to the irony of Blizzard constantly increasing the complexity of the encounters but not making any improvements to the actual UI of the game that you should use for those complex encounters. The biggest example in this season, in this raid, was of course the duo of Ferak and Larodar, where you had to manage to heal ads. The user interface of Blizzard is absolutely atrocious for being able to heal Larodar and Ferak ads, and yet you're just supposed to deal with it. So it's definitely a worthwhile complaint, although I wouldn't put it very high up in terms of the requirements, the wish list for changes in the raid scene. Although we do have to admit the only reason why it's not too big of an issue is because the community is currently fixing this problem. Last of the point being made is about legendaries. This of course is not going to be including much of the player base, only in this case the evokers of Season 2 and the two-handed users of Season 3, but it's definitely a worthwhile point to mention that the RNG levels for a legendary at this point are just not a thing anymore. We are not in vanilla. We shouldn't limit the arrival of a 10% damage boost completely up to RNG. We're also, thank God, not even at the start of Legion, where 10 or 15% damage increases were given out completely at random thanks to Legion legendaries. Even if in this expansion the legendaries are nowhere near at the level of impact and number of Legion legendaries because they are much more limited, still there should be a more deterministic way. Players should be able to mark the date on their calendar of the day they will be able to actually loot this legendary, rather than making it completely RNG, where some players can get their legendary 10 days into the season, others 100 days into the season. The only way in which this type of gap should make sense could be in the term of difficulty of content. Yes, it could make sense. You are doing normal, you're getting your legendary 3 months in, you're doing heroic, you're getting your legendary 2 months in, you're doing mythic, you get your legendary 1 month in. But even then, it should be deterministic, it should be guaranteed, you should know when you get your legendary, what's the timeline of your legendary, rather than the RNG-ness we have gotten so far in this expansion especially. So it's still worth mentioning the last couple of points on legendaries and on the outdated UI Blizzard still has when it comes to raiding, but the previous points are still definitely big points when it comes to raiding. The raid composition becoming more and more restrictive, the tuning being a problem because of the massive gap of difficulty between the early bosses and the later bosses, together with the problems then created by farming, where most of the loot becomes irrelevant because we are able to get to max item level way too early, which makes farming later in the season much more boring, which could be fixed with one of my own takes of just splitting the raid, sure, but not splitting it on release. Creating a 10 boss raid or a 5-3-2 boss raid on release would change nothing. Players would get bored of those 5-3-2 boss raids in the same time they would a 10 boss raid. The difference would be if you split them and then you delay one for months into the season to keep up the engagement on the patch for every player. As well as to reiterate the problem on going back to give something cool to these bosses by the time you are on farm. So adding weekly quests or extra achievements for extra rewards in the raid so that by the time you are farming, so not on progression, not in the first weeks, but by the time you are farming, you can start attempting those bonus difficulty encounters for more or better rewards, which will also help you with the natural nerfing of the bosses over time, 1, 2, 3 months into the season, rather than having Blizzard come in and manually nerf the boss more and more and more, like they have been doing recently with Ferak and with Tindral, for example. So these were the main points for today's thread about Mythic raiding needing some changes. We have went over all of the points as well as what could be a good idea to possibly change. We will see then what possible implementations Blizzard will have in improving the lifestyle of raiders already in Season 4, since Season 4 is a fated season, could be up for some experimentation for the War Within expansion, so maybe we might have some answers already in a couple of months when the next season comes out. However, for today, we can stop with just the questions before hearing any of the answers. I'm going to let you guys go away on your Tuesday. You can let me guys know your own ideas about improvements for the raiding scene down in the comments, together with other ways of helping the channel, for example, by liking the video or subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these pointless things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, we go again. The mysterious allergy that makes the nose itch out of nowhere every time I speak. What is this?